and don't know me yet, I'm David, one of the Cornwall Science Community Committee. I'll try to keep my eye on the tech side of the meeting today. So we are recording this meeting. If you don't want to be seen, please do feel free to turn your camera off. You can change your name if you want to. And this one in future and all past recordings as well can be found on our YouTube channel. So if you want to catch up on any Café side talks that you might have missed, have a look on there. You should be able to find it quite easily, looking for Cornwall Science Community. At this point, I just want to mention as well, we've got a mailing list that you can sign up to, where you can get the links to these Café side talks directly as well, rather than having to sign up via Eventbrite. You should be able to find the sign up link if you go onto our website, so cornwallsciencecommunity.org, and then select the About Us section, where you should be able to find the mailing list. From next week on, we're going to do a slight change to the meeting time. So we're going to be starting half an hour earlier. So the start of these meetings will be 17:30 in the evening, just to give everyone a little bit more time for dinner afterwards, I guess, because we have had people sort of leaving from 6:30, 7 onwards. So from next week onwards, 5:30 will be our meeting time. And with that, I'm going to hand you back over to Ben, who, as he said, he will be chairing this session today. Yes, over to you, Ben.
Thanks, David. Yeah, so welcome everyone. My name is Ben, as David said, one of the committee members for the Cornwall Science Community, and welcome to our fourth virtual Café Sci. And fantastic turnout this week. This is the biggest one we've had so far, so everyone's clearly very keen to hear about bees. The way this works, for any of you that haven't been along to one of these before, is we have a short talk at the beginning from this week from Dr. Beth Roberts, and that'll be around 20-ish minutes. And then we go into a Q&A, which is where we really get into the fun stuff usually. So, and that often lasts a bit longer than the talk itself. And you can ask questions at any point. You can pop it in the chat. So if you move your cursor to the bottom of your screen, you should see a little chat function there. It should pop up on the side of your screen, and you can just type a question there. We'll read it out a bit later on, and we'll also give you a chance, if you want to ask your question in person, we'll give you a chance to do it that way as well. So initially, before the whole situation with COVID came about, we were planning to do an event for Urban Buzz as part of what Bug Life had been doing. Unfortunately, we can't do that at the moment. So what we've got instead this week and next week are some insect themed talks. And obviously this week we've got bees. So today we've got, I'll give her a little introduction. I've got Dr. Beth Roberts, who is an ecologist and a postdoctoral research associate at the European Centre for Environment and Human Health based in Truro. And I believe it was last year, unless I'm remembering that wrong, Beth, you graduated from your PhD studying bumblebee ecology, and you were doing that with Exeter University down at the Penryn campus, just up the road from many of the people here at this talk. And so yeah, I'll let you take it away and do the rest, Beth.
Excellent. So I'm just going to share my screen and cross my fingers and hope for the best. Hopefully you can all see that now.
Yep.
I'm going to decide where best to put you so that I can see.
Yep, that's
what I
fine.
need to be able to see. Cool. So I'm going to stand up so I can gesticulate, but my video is not always great, so you might not be able to see. So as Ben said, my name is Dr. Bethany Roberts, and I did my PhD on the nesting ecology and foraging of bumblebees. And hopefully after this talk, you'll believe that they truly are the bee's knees. So a bit about me. I moved to Cornwall in 2011 to do my undergraduate degree in conservation biology and ecology with the University of Exeter, where I was lucky enough to take part in loads of different activities, from dressing up as a monkey and getting pies put in my face for charity to doing practical conservation work. And it's here that I fell in love with bumblebees and began my bumblebee research journey. So I was lucky enough to be awarded funding for my PhD, which I was supervised by Professor Juliet Osborne. So in the UK, we have three kind of groups of bees. So we have 25 species of bumblebees, over 250 species of solitary bees, but only one species of honeybees. And this is something that people are sometimes surprised about. So what makes bumblebees different to solitary and honeybees? Well, they're social insects, which is different to the solitary bees, and they also tend to nest either underground or in crevices, in walls and hedges. And they're also different sizes. So even within the same colony, they might have different size workers, and that gives them different length tongues. And that allows them to exploit a much greater variety of plants and flower species. And some of them have yellow faces, so some of the males, which means that as males don't sting, you can impress your friends by picking up male bumblebees and they'll think you're so brave. But the most important thing about bumblebees, I think, is that they don't produce honey, and that's something that a lot of people get confused about. And why do we research bumblebees? Apart from them being really important for pollination of crops and wildflowers, a lot of them are in decline. So 98% of the UK's wildflower meadows have been lost since the earlier 20th century due to agricultural practices and increased urbanisation. And this has meant that a lot of the flowers and food that bumblebees relied upon have been experiencing a decline. So on the right, you can see some research that was conducted by Mathilde Bode and her group, and it mainly shows that improved grassland is one of the most abundant habitats in the UK. Actually, it only includes a relatively small amount of plant species that make up the majority of the nectar in this habitat. So Trifolium repens, which is red clover, makes up the majority of nectar in improved grassland. And so one of the ways that we can look to improving the situation for bumblebees and other pollinators could be through improving the floral diversity of this habitat. We also see diseases are part of the decline. It's going to be spread from honeybees to wild bees, but also climate change is meaning that some species are having to move upwards. So bumblebees can regulate their own body temperature, which means they're really great in temperate, colder climates, which is where they're mostly found. But it means that they're not so great at cooling themselves down. So this study by Goulson et al. Shows the moving upwards of the species Bombus distinguendus, which is now only really found in the very northern parts of Scotland. Now I want to move on to talk about the bumblebee life cycle. So my PhD focused largely on the nest searching aspect, as well as then later into the summer. So we see that at the moment in spring, queens have woken up from hibernation. And so the big fluffy bumblebees that you're probably seeing out on your daily walks or in your garden are queen bumblebees. And they need lots of spring resources to give them enough energy to find a nest and to start producing workers. And hopefully this video works. It's a bit jumpy, but basically queens, when they're nest searching, fly low to the ground in a zigzag behaviour, and they crawl around and start to explore potential nest sites. They like to nest in a variety of different types of landscape features, mainly linear features. They use linear features for navigation, so things like field margins, banks, but also in Cornwall we have a really great resource, which is Cornish hedges. These are made of stone, so you've got stone on either side and they're filled with soil. And this means not only have they got loads of crevices for bumblebees to nest in, but they also can provide habitats for loads of flowers, shrubs and trees, which makes them both a nesting and a foraging resource. One of the most common places for bumblebees to nest is in old rodent holes, but some of our species like to nest on the surface, and others, such as the tree bumblebees, which have recently moved over to the UK from Europe, like to nest almost exclusively above ground in things like bird boxes, which we're a nation of bird lovers. We have put up bird boxes everywhere, so they're doing really well in the UK. Next, we move on to the summer period. This is a really busy time for the colony. Nests are growing, and they're basically trying to collect enough food to produce enough workers to then be able to produce queens towards the end of the season. And most colonies will produce males because they take less resources to produce. So another video inside a bumblebee colony, because it's not something you get to see all of the time, but you can kind of see some of the shiny pots. That's where they keep their nectar. Some donut-shaped wax pots with little holes in where you can kind of see grubs. And you can just see that compared to a honeybee colony, it's an absolute mess, very higgledy-piggledy, and that's how bumblebees like to live their lives, which is probably why I love them so much, because most people who know me know that I'm not the tidiest of people. So towards the end of the summer, once the queens have mated, then they go into hibernation. This could be underground or in leaf litter, and then in the spring, the whole cycle begins again. So my PhD research, which was funded by the NERC GW4 and which was conducted at the University of Exeter in the Environment and Sustainability Institute, looked at how bumblebees use Cornish gardens and semi-natural farmland habitats throughout the year. So I was lucky to collect my research in some of the beautiful Cornish gardens that we have here in Cornwall, from some smaller gardens, Bosforthic and Ennis, to some of the larger gardens such as Tritton and Heligan. And I had the garden site and a farmland site, and I focused on banks and Cornish hedges because these are two linear features which we know that bumblebees like to nest search in. So in Cornwall, for those of you who maybe are from further afield, the farmland can be a bit different to other places in the UK. So I'm originally from Norfolk, where we have really big agricultural fields with usually some kind of field margin, whereas in Cornwall we have much smaller farmland fields. They don't always have a field margin, and they occasionally have beautiful views, like the two of my field sites, which I've got pitched up here, where I got to see the sea. So it's a really pleasant place to do research. And also slightly differently to other places in the UK, my field sites at least, didn't have that many flowering crops. So oilseed rape was one of the only flowering crops that was in my field sites, which means that they are predominantly relying on the flowers that are in these margins and in the hedgerows. And going back to farmland, so one of the reasons why it's important to research farmland when we research bumblebees is because 75% of the UK's landscape is made up of farmland. So when you're a bumblebee and you're out foraging, you're probably going to have to include farmland in your foraging area. We wanted to know, how does the farmland habitats compare to Cornish botanical gardens? And we chose this habitat because research has shown that residential gardens are really great resources for bumblebees, especially in urban areas. And so we wondered whether scaling up to big botanical gardens, we would see the same kinds of effects. One of the reasons why gardens and botanical gardens are so great for bumblebees is because they're much less disturbed compared to farmland. And they can potentially have resources all year round because gardens want to attract visitors all year round. They have a more diverse range of habitats within them. But in Cornwall, we have slightly different types of botanical gardens that you might see other places in the UK. So a lot of the gardeners describe them as early gardens, and they have a lot of species such as rhododendron and camellias, which are very early. But importantly, they're a resource and a habitat that is surrounded by the farmland habitat. So we wanted to know, how are the bumblebees using these two closely linked but quite different types of habitats? So apologies, I know scientists love graphs. I know lots of other people don't love graphs, but I'm going to talk you through it, and it hopefully won't be as scary as it seems. basically what this is showing is, in green we have the botanical gardens, and in blue we have the semi-natural farmland habitats. And this is showing the number of flowers throughout the year, from early spring on the left-hand side to late summer on the right-hand side. And what we see is that botanical gardens are providing a really good floral resource up until kind of late spring, sorry. Whereas suddenly we get to early summer and we see this massive increase in flowering resources in the farmland habitats. To show that a bit differently, we've got the pink flowers here, which show the botanical gardens, the daisies, which show the farmland, and one of these flowers is 1,000 flowering units. So in early spring, gardens had around 24,000 flowers across all 8 sites, whereas farmland only had around 2,000. So botanical gardens were providing this really great early spring resource, which, as we know from the life cycle, is really important for the queen bumblebees who are just emerging from hibernation, have low energy resources, and need a lot of nectar to be able to find their nests and produce the workers. Then moving into the early summer, we see that farmland has more than double the number of flowers compared to the botanical gardens. And this was mainly made up of red campion and bramble. Red campion, even though it was really widely spread and very common, wasn't used as much as you'd expect, whereas bramble was used by a high number of bumblebee species, and so is a much more useful resource for bumblebees. And so if you have any brambles in your garden, they're not weeds, they're great, bumblebees love them. And another fairly obvious difference between gardens and farmland is the difference in the exotics and native species. So in the botanical gardens, 74% of the plants that were being used by bumblebees were exotic, whereas in the farmland, 90% of the plants were native. And that means that the botanical gardens also had a lot more plant species, a lot more variety, which means that it can potentially have a lot more bumblebee species within that type of habitat. So looking at what bumblebees are around, firstly, I looked at nest searching queens. So I did surveys and counted the number of queens I saw nest searching in each of the 2 habitats. And I found that botanical gardens had significantly more nest searching queens compared to farmland. Because when we look at the abundance of bumblebees and the number of bumblebee species, so number of species is the bottom left graph, the number of bumblebees is the top right graph, we see that it loosely follows the floral resources. So in June, farmland have more species of bumblebee compared to gardens, and there are more bumblebees overall in farmland in August compared to the gardens, and this was mainly made up of males, so potentially farmland is a really important habitat for male bumblebees. Importantly, how can we help bumblebees, and what can you all do now that you love bumblebees more than anything to try and help them? So the first thing is you can learn to identify bumblebees. It seems tricky. Before I did my PhD, I thought I would learn how to ID bumblebees, and for some reason very quickly gave up, but I promise you it's not that difficult. The first thing to do is look at what colour is their tail. They'll either have a white tail, a red tail, or a yellowy buff tail. The second thing to look at is how many stripes do they have. So we can see here that this bumblebee has a white tail and 2 yellow stripes. Helpfully, it's called the white-tailed bumblebee. And this is one of the species that we can see has the males that have the yellow faces. In the UK, even though we have 25 species of bumblebee, there's about 7 that are really commonly seen. So if you're out and about, these are probably the bumblebees that you need to focus on. And probably the trickiest of these to identify is the bottom left bumblebee. So that's the garden bumblebee. and it looks like it might have 2 stripes, but it's got a sneaky 3rd stripe in the middle. So in the middle of its body, those are 2 separate stripes. But the giveaway with this species is it has the longest face of any of the bumblebee species, and that's because it has the longest tongue. So that means that it can feed from flowers that have really deep corolla tubes and access the nectar that's deep down in those flowers. If you want to plant some flowers for bumblebees, then it's really important to provide a range of flowers to support the bumblebees of all different tongue lengths. And also, because of what we know about the nesting season, bumblebees need a good number of flowers across the entire season, from the spring to the late summer. So make sure that you're planting things that will provide a resource all year round. Avoid any fancy cultivars and ornamental varieties. These often have double petals and are usually produced to look beautiful and may not produce any nectar. Plant in clumps. Bumblebees really love to be able to, if they find a good resource, then they'll remember it. And also think about the pesticides and chemicals that could be in the plants that you're buying. So ask your garden centres or your plant suppliers where they get their plants from. There are loads of projects to get involved with. So in Cornwall, we have Penryn Buzz. You can find them on Facebook. They're based in Penryn, but it could be inspiration for you to do in your local area. They've created an online map where you can drop a little pin of if you've done some planting, so you can walk around and find the really great bumblebee habitats throughout Penryn, but it's something you could do in your local area. It was just done by volunteers. You could also download the Bumblebees of Cornwall and Scilly book by Patrick Saunders, and there's probably other versions of these for different counties and different areas in the UK. Ben mentioned Bug Life at the beginning of this talk, and they've done their Urban Buzz project, which was in Falmouth, but also in other places. And that planted loads of wildflower habitats across different urban locations, so parks and green spaces, but also their Beelines project, which aims to make these amazing pollinator habitat corridors across the UK. You can find the ones in your area, and you can add on any pollinator planting that you've done. And also contact your local councillors and MPs. Make sure that they know that this is something that you're passionate about, and see what they think that you could do in your area to make it more bumblebee friendly. Thank you very much for listening. If you want to find out more about my research, then I've published 2 papers from my PhD, both of which are open source, and the details of those are at the bottom. All the other references that I've done throughout the presentation are also open source, so you can go and find the PDFs of those. So yeah, thank you very much, and hope you have lots of questions.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Beth. Yes, please. That'd be great. Okay, cool. Brilliant. Well, thank you very much. Fascinating talk, and so much to know about bumblebees. So at this point, for those of you in the talk, like I said at the beginning, you can go into the chat function by scrolling to the bottom of the screen and hitting the chat box. And if you have a question, you can type it in there. While waiting for people to do that, I've got a few just to get us started. This is one you actually sort of covered a little bit in the talk with some links you put in there. But for those of us that want to go out and maybe have a look to see what bumblebees we can find, whereabouts should we be looking? And are there any good handheld guides you could take out with you when you're out on a walk?
Yeah, so the Bumblebee Conservation Trust has some really good online tips for identification, so that's where I got the images for the slides. Also, I've got it next to me. The field guide to the bees of Great Britain and Ireland is also really good. That has bumblebees and solitary bees and has some really beautiful illustrations of those, and also keys for those people who aren't terrified to use keys, but I cannot include myself in one of those.
I was going to ask how they work, but if that's the case, then maybe that's not so.
For bumblebees, surprisingly, so solitary bees are smaller than bumblebees, but bumblebees are actually harder to key out and identify because bumblebees can be a lot more variable in their coloration. So you might get a really melanistic dark form of a species, and so it can just completely catch you out. Whereas at least solitary bees, if you're going to key them out under a microscope, you'll probably get to the species easier.
Fantastic, thank you. Okay, we've had all sorts of questions flooding in here, so thanks everyone for engaging. Lots of messages that say, just a great talk, Beth, so that's great. And so I'm going to start with Kate Littler's question. It says, great talk, thank you. How large is a typical bumblebee home range?
That's a really good question. So we don't know exactly because it's really difficult to track and follow bumblebees, but we know roughly that it can vary between species. So the buff-tailed bumblebee, which is one of the most common bumblebee species, probably has one of the biggest ranges. So Dave Goulson did a study where he had a colony of bumblebees. He took some of the workers to different distances. So the furthest distance that he drove these bumblebees away was 10 kilometers and released them, and they were able to find their way back to the nest. So they do this by using features in the landscape. So it could be a big tree or a telephone mast or anything that helps them to pinpoint their way down. Whereas other species such as the common carder bumblebees, which are the little orange ones, will fly maybe only a couple of 100 meters. And that's something that's really important to consider, because then if you're a species with a short foraging range and you're not within a very good habitat, then it means that you've got less access to good foraging resources. Whereas if you're a species with a longer foraging range, you're more likely within your foraging area to find good resources. So that's why we see different species are more or less affected by habitat declines.
Fantastic, thank you, Beth. Okay, next one is from Chloe, which says, why do you think male bumblebees use farmland more than the botanical gardens?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question, and it would be really cool to study that more. So male bumblebees, particularly of UK species, so the tree bumblebee is the only exception, when they're trying to find a mate, they do a behaviour called trap lining, and that's where they fly along the same path and they lay some scent down on the same bit of foliage or whatever they're using to mark their trap line. And that means that when the females come along, the queens, then they will be attracted to these pheromones, and then that's how mating can occur. So potentially it could be because the farmland is a more open habitat, so the males kind of see it as somewhere where it's easier to attract a female. But it could just be because there was a particular food resource in that habitat at that time that was really popular with the bumblebees.
Excellent, thank you. Okay, next one. There's all manner of questions coming, so thank you everyone for engaging here. Hopefully we'll get through them all. So are there any studies or research about the consequences of bees foraging on exotic plants versus native plants? Anything you come across there?
Yeah, so there are quite a few different studies, and the findings seem to be variable. So some studies will say that they prefer to forage on the native species. Some studies will find that they prefer to forage on exotic species. Other studies find a mix. In some cases, it's that, so there are generalist species and specialist species. So generalist bumblebees can forage on loads of different flowers, whereas specialists might only focus on a certain species or a certain family. And so they can sometimes respond differently, but it just seems variable. And I think the main thing is that we're seeing that the exotic species can help to extend the flowering seasons beyond the native species. So now that the weather and the climate is warming, Bombus terrestris, the buff-tailed bumblebee, can overwinter in the UK and stay active throughout the winter, and they mainly forage on exotic species which are flowering at those times. So yeah, they can be of variable importance, I think, depending on what other resources are around.
Excellent. Okay, moving on. I quite like this one. This one is from Megan saying, do the European bees that have moved over here get on well with our native bees? And thanks for the talk, smiley face.
So this is something that is currently being researched, because they've only been over here for a few years. They potentially aren't kind of excluding our bees from nesting resources, because they tend to nest almost exclusively aerially, so only above ground in tree crevices or nest boxes, whereas our bumblebees don't tend to nest in those resources. But yeah, we don't know if they are having any impact on the competition for foraging resources, but they've only come from Europe, and most of our bumblebee species are also found in Europe, so I would imagine that they can happily coexist.
That's good to hear. Next question comes in from Henry that says, can you say anything about bumblebee numbers and distribution patterns? I'm guessing that's sort of a nationally question.
So we know that bumblebees have been in decline. We know they've experienced very sharp declines. And I'm not an expert in that per se, but from my perspective, it feels like they experienced sharp declines because of the agricultural intensification. But now, hopefully, we're on a kind of baseline, and unless climate change seriously negatively impacts them in ways that we don't know yet, then I think they've kind of reached a stable equilibrium for most species. Some specialist species are still going to be struggling. So there's, in Kent, has been a reintroduction program of the great-haired bumblebee, the short-haired bumblebee, I think it is, which went extinct in the UK. They've reintroduced it using queens, I think from Europe. They tried to get them from New Zealand, but I don't think they were viable because we took over our bumblebee species to New Zealand, so we've kind of spread them around the world. In terms of distribution, no, I'm not an expert in that. And it's really difficult because they can be hard to identify. So, for example, the buff-tailed bumblebee, you look at its distribution, it's everywhere in the UK, whereas the white-tailed bumblebee looks like it has a really small distribution, but it's just because it's harder to identify. So it can sometimes be misleading, which is why the more people that can identify bumblebees, the more people that record the bumblebees they see, the more we'll know about distributions.
Brilliant, thanks, Beth. I guess that's one of the things about doing a PhD as well. When people hear that you have a PhD in something, they expect you might be an expert in absolutely everything, but actually, PhD really is just learning an awful lot about a very tiny aspect of something very specific. Is that right?
Yeah, that is accurate.
But yeah, I'm guessing as well, some of the links that you had in the talk might actually take you through to websites and places where you can find out a bit more about distributions and things like that as well.
Yeah. So the Bumblebee Conservation Trust, I think, yeah, they have the distributions up on there. Yeah, and your local recording centres. So in Cornwall, we have ERCIS, which is the Environmental Record Centre for Cornwall and the Isles of Scilly, and everywhere has a local record centre. So you can, a lot of them are online now. You can go online and look at your local distributions, or you can look at like the National Biodiversity Network, which has distributions for all species across the UK. Don't say that when you've had a few to drink.
I'll try not to. Brilliant. And yeah, and all those links will be on the talk when we upload this to the YouTube channel later on as well. Next question is from one of our regulars, from Graymond. Welcome back again, Graymond. Why do they keep flying indoors to be gobbled up by lurking spiders? And I was going to ask this too, because I had one fly in the window in the kitchen this morning when I was making my breakfast.
Maybe your house smells really nice. I think they just, like everything, they're trying to coexist with people, and it's really easy for them to get trapped indoors. But yeah, they don't always seem very good at getting out. Usually, apparently, if they can sense an open window, they're meant to be able to fly out. But yeah, half of the time they just get stuck. So I would just try and, you know, put them in a jar or a glass and take them back outside.
Yeah, the one I had this morning was on the open window and it just got nowhere near. I had to get like a tea towel and like gently waft it out. But it got there in the end. Okay, next one is from, I hope I pronounced this right, V. Zakulo. I was wondering what the effects of current agricultural pesticides on bees is. Is there any research you've come across on that?
So yeah, that is not an area that I'm an expert in. But again, like with the exotic species, it can be very variable. So it's really hard to research that kind of thing at the kind of outside in the wild. So we often do lab studies, and we'll often do lab studies at different kind of strengths of pesticides. But yeah, there's lots of different research. And so I would encourage you to, if you're interested in these things, then you can go on to Google Scholar, and if you type in kind of keywords and things, then often you can find research papers. You can't always access them, which is really frustrating, but if you find the title and copy it into Google Scholar, followed by PDF, you're more likely to get a PDF of those papers. And so, yeah, it's something that everyone can do at home if they're interested.
So in this case, you go onto Google Scholar and type in something like agricultural pesticides, bees, and see what comes up and see what research has been done.
Yeah, there's a whole world of research. I think a lot of us tend to get our information from the news or social media, which isn't always accurate. Everyone has different levels of accuracies from where you get your information. So always try and look for the scientific research where you can.
Marvellous. Okay, next question. It's from Ashley Jones. Says, well done and thank you, Beth. And did you say the males are non-stinging? And yeah, this surprised me as well, this one. Is that true?
Yeah. Thank you. That's Sam's dad, my boyfriend. So I feel famous, all my family is watching. Yeah, so the males don't sting, I guess because their main aim is just to find a mate. And so the queens, when they're produced, so one colony, if it's a really successful colony, could produce hundreds of queens, which is quite different to honeybees where they'll only produce a few. And they'll produce loads of males. And so the queen bumblebees, because they need to put on more weight and gain more energy, then they will stay within the colony for a few days. So they'll go out and forage and use the colony as a base. Whereas males, once they've hatched, they just leave the colony. So they don't have any pollen baskets. They just need to go out and find a mate. Because they're less energy intensive to produce, they use the same amount of energy as a worker to produce, whereas queens will cost about 3 times more energy to produce. It means that there's usually around 7 males to every 1 queen. So a lot of males do not fulfill their destiny, unfortunately. And so I guess they don't need to protect the colony, so I guess that's why they don't need to sting.
Okay, well, yeah, I've learned something new today. And how easy is it to tell the difference between a male and a female queen?
Yeah, sometimes it feels quite easy because the males of some species will look a bit more scraggly, if that's a fair
bit like
thing
humans
to say. Not all humans, some males are very well presented. But yeah, in general, they're smaller, they have slightly longer antennae, but yeah, easiest way to tell them is if it is a species that has the yellow nose and yellow faces. Often that's really distinctive. It'll be kind of really yellow all over their head and face. And yeah, the only other way is that they don't have pollen baskets, so their rear legs are much thinner. But I'm sure if you've ever seen a bumblebee, you'll know that they do not sit still. They're just all over the place. And so male bumblebees are no different.
Brilliant, thank you very much. And I guess it just comes to practice as well, being able to tell the difference between the two.
Yeah, although sometimes because males don't have to provide for the colony, it does mean that you'll often find them, especially towards the end of the summer, kind of aggregating on certain flowers. So especially thistles, if you see lots of bumblebees just sitting around on the thistles, then they're more likely to be males, because a worker bumblebee, she would be going out collecting the pollen or nectar and then going back to the colony, so they need to move around a lot more. So that's another way, I guess, of finding a male.
Brilliant, thank you. Okay, next question comes in from Robin, who has been chairing our past few meetings. He's having a nice quiet day today. He says, so the grubbing up of hedgerows was bad for bees, not just by impoverishing the habitat in terms of the area, but also by disrupting their navigation. Is that right?
So potentially, yeah. So bees like to use linear features like hedgerows for navigation. So you'll often, if you are standing and watching, you'll notice that they do tend to fly along hedgerows. So I imagine it would have been harder for them to navigate. They probably would have found another way. They have really amazing brains for navigation. I mean, if you kind of dropped me in the middle of a landscape and said, Beth, just find your way back to your house, I would really struggle. But bumblebees have, yeah, very well developed, they look like mushrooms if you see a image of a bumblebee's brain, and that's what helps them to navigate so well. So yeah, probably when we took away hedgerows for a while, then it probably did have an impact, but I imagine they would have quite quickly switched on to other linear features that we might not even notice within a landscape.
It's amazing that something so small can have such a complex navigation system.
Yeah, but they can get really confused really easily. So if you move something near to their nest, so when I was doing my research, I would spend a lot of time in the Cornish gardens. Sometimes you might find a nest. If I found a nest, I'd get super excited, because you don't find them that often, because honeybees and wasps tend to have really big nests of potentially thousands of individuals, whereas bumblebee nests are much smaller. So even the species with the largest nest, which is the buff-tailed bumblebee, might only have around 750 workers in them. So if you come across a nest, it's really special. And so I'd sit patiently and wait for the bumblebees to come back. And just me sitting there, they would fly along, kind of look at me and think, well, I didn't see you the last time, so this can't be where I live. Would just fly away. So yeah, they can, I think, not always help themselves. But it means that because of their way of navigating and remembering, it means that sometimes you might notice that they use you for a landmark. So if you've ever been stood by a patch of flowers and a bee kind of comes and looks at you, that's because it's using you as a landmark, because you're a really distinctive feature within that habitat. So it's kind of found a patch of flowers, it really likes the patch of flowers, it, yeah, remembers you for the patch of flowers, and then it flies away. So it's kind of unfortunate, but it's really cool to see it in action.
So if, say, you were out on a walk, I would say I was out on a walk and I came across a bumblebee nest in a woodland somewhere or something like that, and I stood and watched it for a while, if I was to come back, should I stand in the same place every time to help them with their navigation?
It depends if they've used you as their, navigation reference. And I think it probably also depends on how old, I guess, the bumblebee is and how experienced it is. So if I don't know, if you know more about honeybees, then, so honeybees, it's an age system, depends on what task that they perform. Whereas for bumblebees, that's not the case. So every bumblebee has its own kind of thresholds for when it wants to do something. So if you're a bumblebee that has a really kind of high threshold for foraging, then you'll forage all of the time, whereas another bumblebee might only forage when they're absolutely desperate. And so that means that most bumblebees will be going out foraging. So as you become more experienced and have foraged for a lot longer, you probably will get less confused about where your nest is. Whereas I guess if you're a more novel forager, then it's probably much easier to get confused and to get lost.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
If you do come across a nest, how much space should you give them? How close can you observe from a safe distance?
So it depends what kind of nest, I guess. So because most of the nests that you'll find are underground, probably what you'll see is just a hole, like a rodent hole maybe. And so even if you stood quite near, they're usually not going to get that annoyed. Some species can get more annoyed. So the tree bumblebee, which is the one that's kind of come over more recently from Europe, tend to have little guard bees around the entrance to their nest who just kind of sit and watch. I don't know if it's to stop males coming in. So I said that the males of the UK species do trap lining, but the males of the tree bumblebees gather around the entrance to a nest that they know have queens in them in a kind of cloud. And so that's often can be the species that we'll find the most nests of because of this. We'll see this kind of what we would think of as swarm. So it's really important to remember at that point that the males are harmless and can't sting, because I think it's at that point when more people would kind of maybe call pest control or be scared because they're worried about getting stung. But in general, bumblebees are very docile. They're quite happy to coexist. So we had a bumblebee nest once in our garden back at my home in Norfolk. We were having a barbecue, and they would just kind of fly to and from the nest, which was just behind where we were sat, not bothering about where we were. So they're pretty chill.
Brilliant. Okay, we've gone off on a bit of a tangent there. So let's get back to the questions. This next one is from Milo, who's 9 years old. And it says, if I find a bumblebee that isn't moving much, is there a way to help revive it, or how can I help it?
Yeah. So bumblebees need a lot of energy. Flying is very energy intensive, as you can imagine. If you're a bumblebee flying around, then you would need to visit loads and loads and loads of plants. So sometimes they get really tired because they can't find enough plants. And there's a couple of things that you can do. So you can either make some sugary water with a teaspoon of sugar and offer that to the bumblebee. And that can be really cool because you can see how their tongue works, which looks really fun. So they kind of have this initial kind of shaft that comes out, and then their like little tongue comes out of the end. It's really sweet. And another thing that you can do is to kind of safely pick them up. So you could use a bit of paper or a big leaf or something and pop them onto a nearby patch of flowers, and then they can feed from the flowers themselves. Something that you shouldn't do is to give them honey, because the honey, you don't know where it's come from, and it might contain some kind of pathogen or disease from a honeybee colony that wouldn't be very good for the bumblebee.
Brilliant. I think that answers a couple of other questions we've got here as well, so that's fantastic. Good question, that, Milo. Next one from Sally Ann. I like this one as well. How do they manage to fly? They seem to defy the laws of physics.
I know, they're very impressive. And yeah, that's often something that I marvel at, especially the queens, because they're so huge that sometimes they do really struggle to take off. If you kind of watch them, they might try and kind of crawl up a blade of grass or up a stem or something to kind of give them a bit of height. It helps them to take off better. But yeah, they're just very talented. They have very good, so insects with wings have something called wing loading, which is how much extra weight they can take. So bumblebees obviously are quite small, but they can carry quite a lot of pollen. But it's one of the reasons why we can't track them as well, because GPS little units, even though they are being developed, are still quite heavy, and so it means that the bumblebees can't fly as much, they have to rest more. So that's kind of the area where I'm most excited about in the future, when hopefully we have really small tags, small enough to be able to track where the bumblebees go, and that will just allow us to find out so much more about where they nest, and yeah, how many nests landscapes can support. So yeah, it's a really frustrating thing about bumblebees is how small they are and how, yeah, little weight they can carry.
It's also one of the most endearing things, I suppose. So
Yeah.
Another one from Greymond here. How do you count the number of bees in, say, somewhere like Trellisik Garden? Are there a multitude of you in your team? So how do you go about doing all that?
So unfortunately, there was just me and my little team. It might have been nice to have a team of people. So what you do is you have to choose specific transects within your area. So within each garden, I would do a 100-meter transect on a Cornish hedge and a 100-meter transect on a bank. And then I would walk it for 20 minutes when I was doing my nest searching survey. So you'd walk along it for 10 minutes and then you'd walk back along it for 10 minutes, recording all of the bumblebees that you see. And that's really common in a lot of research, especially for pollinators, is to do these shorter transects. And depending on what you're interested in, you might do more than 1 or 2 transects in a habitat. But for the purposes of my research, I just did 2.
And you can extrapolate from that. Is that right?
Yeah, so other studies, so for example, there's a research group in Bristol who have done the most research or the most extensive research on urban pollinators and what habitats they use. And so yeah, what they've done is they would take an entire city, so Bristol, they would map all of the different types of habitat within that, and then they would do systematic sampling where they would do transects of a specific length in like relative to the area of habitat. So it means that you're covering lots of different habitats whilst only having to do quite short transects in each of them. And then yeah, like Ben said, you can then extrapolate up from that what kinds of habitats bumblebees are using and what floral resources are in those habitats. So that's really the best, most rigorous way of sampling a habitat, is you would pick a site and then you would systematically sample every single habitat within that.
So you're not literally going around picking out every single bumblebee?
No, it would be exhausting. And so yeah, you only then do it's usually 2 meters either side of you and kind of 2 to 4 meters high, because so that was something that was actually really frustrating about the nest searching queen surveys that I did, because there are so many rhododendrons and they're a really great resource of queens, but a lot of them are up really high. So it's trying to then get a method. In hindsight, I would have had some kind of method that would have allowed me to try and survey up really high for the queen bumblebees, because otherwise you're just missing a whole host of data points.
Marvellous, thank you. Okay, next one is from Loveday Jenkin. So with the research you've been doing, are you feeding the value of Cornish hedges into the DEFRA consultation on the revision of farm environmental grants? I hope I've got that right.
That sounds really interesting. No, I'm not, but potentially one of my colleagues is. So he is doing his PhD on road verges and is more specifically looking into different types of verges and specifically into Cornish hedges. So yeah, that's probably something that he is feeding into more extensively with his research. But yeah, definitely something that I'll look into.
It's the beauty of a research group, I guess, is different people exploring different angles and things like that.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, next one from Ross Biddle. So do you know what colour their eyes are most sensitive to? That's a good question.
That is a very good question. I don't know what colour their eyes are most sensitive to, but I do know that bumblebees are born with an innate preference for blue. flowers. So yeah, maybe that's the color that the eyes are more focused on. So yeah, if you're a bumblebee and you're out foraging, then you would, yeah, potentially preferentially, if you, so they do this kind of with lab experiments, so to test the different colors. But because bumblebees are, I like to think, very clever, so they can quickly switch their preferences depending on the nectar reward that they get from flowers. So they might be born with this innate preference for blue, but then if you suddenly switch, so all of the blue flowers have no nectar and all the yellow flowers had loads of nectar, they would visit the yellow flowers, and then they would relearn if you kind of changed it again. So they can very quickly adapt to the nectar resources provided by all the different types of flowers.
Excellent. Okay, one from Maria here, which is, this relates back to one of the videos you showed earlier, I think. So what's the reason for the zigzag motion when looking for a nest?
I'm not actually sure why the zigzag motion when they're looking for a nest, whether it's just a way of covering ground. Maybe it's this is not a scientific answer, so do not, just close your ears. But I don't know, I've just had a picture of, if you're under fire and the advice is you run, in like a zigzag motion to prevent attack. Well, queen bumblebees obviously hold all the genetic material for the rest of the colony, and so they're very at risk, like very vulnerable in the stage where they don't have a nest. So potentially it is some kind of way of trying to be less seen, maybe, and trying to get caught less. But that is not based on science. That was out of the magic of Beth's brain.
Well, we always enjoy the magic of Beth's brain. Like we said earlier, doing a PhD doesn't mean you know absolutely everything about all of it. So. But yeah, it's an interesting one. I wonder if there's anything, maybe that's one for Google Scholar again to see if
there's not loads of literature out there on nest searching, so potentially I'm just looking to the left because I have my whole stack of bumblebee books just in case I needed to refer to them. But there are, so like the Humble Bumblebee, it's Life History by Sladen. And so actually when I'm doing a lot of my research, a lot of the kind of ecology side, so the behaviour of bumblebees and the nesting, I got from this book, and this was first published in 1912. So it's actually information from kind of some of the, older, I guess, pioneering naturalists who have provided us with a lot of information. And I guess that's because bumblebees and other species of insects and wildlife were more prevalent back then. So they describe often kind of, they'll go out in their horse and cart and literally just see bumblebee nests and count bumblebee nests while they're going along. That's how kind of abundant they were back then. So yeah, I can't remember the question, but basically it could be somewhere in these books because they kind of used to spend all their time just sitting and observing things, which is something that we don't do as much now.
There we go. Maybe it's a PhD for someone in the future, working out why bumblebees zigzag. Moving on, I'm conscious of time because we need to let you go by about 20 past today. All sorts of good questions here. One here from Samantha, which is a bit off topic perhaps, but you mentioned that your published papers are open source. And do you think this is important for engaging people with research? And it might be worth just saying for those that aren't aware what open source research is.
Yeah. So as scientists, we do research and then we publish that research in scientific journals. But a lot of the time, these journals are so what we would call behind a paywall. So you have to pay to access the science that's within those journals, either as a subscription to the journal or you can buy individual articles, which is fairly ridiculous, seeing as a lot of science is funded by the public, and then as a scientist you have to pay to publish in those journals, and then you also have to pay to read your science in those journals. So me personally, open access is something that's really important. And so that basically means that when research is published, people can access that paper for free. And I think that's something that's becoming much more common in the science world. And so, yeah, hopefully in the future, it will become much more accessible to the public, because it just doesn't make sense that it's not.
Absolutely. I think a lot of people would agree with you on that one there.
Mm.
Here's a good question as well from Sophie. Has your shirt got bumblebees on?
Yeah, but I'm really reticent to say, but I think there might be honeybees, based on the fact that they have a little, you probably can't see it, but an old-fashioned kind of honeybee hive picture on it. But it's my most bee shirt, so I had to wear it.
Well, I won't get you started right now on the difference between bumblebees and honeybees, because we'll be here for hours. Still a good shirt though. A question here from Amanda. Is the main purpose of a bumblebee to pollinate crops?
So bumblebees, I guess it depends how you see them. So bumblebees and other wild pollinators like solitary bees and honeybees all are really important for pollination. They also pollinate all of our wildflowers. So without them, we wouldn't have any of our wildflowers. But yeah, in terms of pollination, they are really important worldwide. So bumblebees are particularly important because in cooler climates, they can forage at much lower temperatures compared to honeybees, and they can forage in the rain. So they're used for predominantly kind of glasshouse crops, so cucumbers and aubergines and peppers, and that's what they're mainly commercially used for. So you can buy, as a commercial producer of lots of different crops, bumblebee colonies to pollinate inside your glasshouses. And they're particularly important because they do a special type of pollination, which is called buzz pollination. So this is really important for tomatoes, because on the tomato plant, the pollen is packed really tightly onto the anthers. The bumblebees will wrap their bodies around them, and they'll vibrate at a really specific frequency that unlocks the pollen and shakes all of the pollen off. And that's something that honeybees and other bee species are not able to do. So yeah, they're really important for some specific crop species.
Good to know. Oh, you mentioned that you had all your books with you next year. Question from Mahira here is, great talk. Can you please recommend a book that's an interesting read about bumblebees? It sounds like you might have a few there.
So, whole collection. I think The Humble Bee is a really good one, not only because it has lots of information about bumblebees, but because it's written in a absolutely hilarious and beautiful language, and a kind of language that we don't really use in science or in modern I want to say technology, but kind of more modern books. We use much more kind of less exciting language, whereas the way that they describe bumblebees is really nice. If you just want to, I guess, like break your bank account, then Bumblebees by Ted Benton is huge and kind of condenses lots of different literature all into one space. But yeah, that one's quite expensive. So I'd say The Humble Bee by Sladen.
Excellent. There's one for us all to go and pick up a copy of. So another one from Kate, who had a question earlier. How long do bumblebees, the worker bumblebees that is, how long do they tend to live for?
So it can depend, but the worker bumblebees will live for usually the least amount of time. It could be anything up to a couple of weeks, and that's because it's dangerous to go out foraging and it's energy intensive. So you could get lost, you could get eaten, you could just run out of energy and not make it back to the nest. So yeah, foragers do tend to live less long than bees, who might have more of a tendency to stay within the nest and do the like feed the brood and clean the nest.
There we go. This next one, this is a whole different kind of question from what we've had so far. It's almost more of an ethical one, I guess, from Sophie. So I know you said you study bumblebees and that they don't produce honey, but why do some vegans eat honey and some don't? Isn't honey a byproduct of pollination? So you're not taking anything as such away from them. Surely picking flowers is the same concept as you're affecting their habitat. So good question.
That is a good question. So I would argue that honeybees are not a wild pollinator, but they are a farmed species, because most honeybees are kept within hives and managed by a beekeeper, much like a farmer would have his flock of cows or a herd of pigs. A flock of cows, a herd of cows. And so I think that's why a lot of vegans don't eat honey, because they kind of see honeybees as a managed, farmed insect. And the reason why bumblebees don't produce honey and honeybees do is because bumblebees, their colony only lives for a few weeks within the summer, whereas honeybees can have colonies that can last for multiple years. And honey is really long lasting. So honey is basically just nectar that's had some other things added to it that means it will last for a long time. So by harvesting that honey, taking away its resource, you are then impacting the colony's ability to survive over the winter. Obviously, as a beekeeper, you don't want to do that, so they will supplementary feed the honeybee colonies with sugar solution, or they will kind of only take honey up to a certain date, and then any honey that's produced after that, they will kind of not produce. And I think it's usually when the ivy starts flowering, because ivy is a really great late season resource for all pollinators, and apparently it makes honey taste disgusting. So it's kind of a win-win, I guess, for the honeybees.
Well, there you go. A whole different kind of question there. Got a few more questions to go through before we let you all go. Thank you to everyone in the chat who's been adding in useful links and other little facts and things like that as well. It's been some really good discussion going on here. Another question from Robin. So how much variety is there in the behaviour or say talents of different bee groups? Are some very different in their lifestyles compared to others?
So in terms of bumblebees, I guess, compared to solitary bees will, as the name suggests, nest solitarily. So often in they might dig a hole if they're a mining bee in mud or sandy bank, or they might nest in, you've probably seen the bee hotels in bamboo, in the holes there. And so that's very different to bumblebees, where they'll have queen, and then they'll have the workers, and then the workers go out and do the foraging, whereas for solitary bees, the female lays all of the eggs and she has to go and forage. And in not bee species, but some wasp species, they're even more impressive, because there are some solitary wasps which will lay an egg somewhere, have multiple nests with different eggs in, and they will provision those nests. So they will remember where those tiny holes are, and they will go out and get some like caterpillar and bring it back, provision it, and go away and kind of come back and keep doing that over several days and weeks, I guess, until the larvae hatches. So yeah, there's loads of cool Hymenoptera, so that's bees, wasps and ants, and I think that they should be your favorite types of insects because they're the best.
I had a feeling you'd say that, but that's brilliant. There's so much variation there. We're getting down to our last few questions here, and thank you everyone for sending them in. one from Tanya. I think this might be Tanya and Milo. How many times can a bumblebee beat its wings per second? Any ideas?
I wish I knew that. I don't know that. You'll have to Google it. It's always the trusty source. But it is a very impressive amount. You definitely couldn't flap your arms that many times.
No, I'd like to see people try though, but warm up before you do it. Here's a nice one here from Charlotte Watson. So thanks for the talk, Beth. I'm doing my dissertation on the effects of different habitats on bumblebees, so your research is really interesting. What effects do you think crop rotation has on their success?
So again, I don't know loads about crop rotation. So as is Ben keeps saying, like when you do a PhD, you'll do very specialist knowledge in certain things, and I didn't really look at pollination. I think the main benefit to crop rotation would be through probably more so just the benefits it has to the soil in general and for other habitats in general. So because bumblebees they don't persist over kind of like the winter, so the colony in the summer of one crop won't benefit necessarily from the next year and what crop that might have, but it could be beneficial for, like I said, some species don't fly as far, so actually through rotating your crops, it means that if one year it didn't have any flowers and the next year it was going to have a flowering crop, and you're a bumblebee that wakes up from hibernation and needs to nest there, then that can be really beneficial. Whereas if it was constantly a non-flowering crop like wheat, then you're never getting any kind of food resource being put in place. So yeah, I think it probably has multiple different potential benefits. That was lots of caveats.
There always is with these kind of things.
We love a caveat. Caveats and limitations.
Exactly. Just popping back to the previous question about how many times a bee can beat its wings, Ashley has already gone and found us the answer, saying 190 wing beats per second according to Dr. Google. So great work, wow. Ashley. That was some speedy work right there. Going to have a couple more, and then I think we're going to have to let you go. Let's see. All sorts going on here. One from a hero. Which birds or animals prey on bumblebees?
So that's a really great question, because I actually did two of my chapters ended up being on badger predation of bumblebee nests, which is something that probably most people would never even have considered. I'm not even sure why I managed to consider it. So yeah, the biggest thing that predates a bumblebee whole entire colony is the badger, but individual bumblebees are preyed upon by birds, so great tits. You'll often kind of, if there's so when I was doing my surveys, the big rhododendron trees that I talked about, sadly, you kind of walk along underneath them and you'd notice some big queen empty kind of shells, and you could hear the great tits having a great time up above, kind of taking out the queen bumblebees. It's, I guess in a really morbid way, it's kind of cool. So they scoop out the thorax, like they make a really perfect hole, and then they kind of just chop off the tail and scoop out everything from the abdomen. So yeah, gruesome, but really interesting.
Yes, behaviour a lot of people have no idea about.
The
cute cuddly badgers. Okay, yeah. Well, I think we've got time for one more here. Lots of really nice messages coming in from all of you guys. That's really great to see. Thank you. There was one here. I've lost it now. Where is it? I think from Tanya and Milo. Once lockdown's over, at my dad's we're going to get honeybees. Well, that's a really good thing to be doing. That's going to give you hours of entertainment, and hopefully some delicious honey as well. Last question I'm going to go for is from Susan. So wonderful program, Beth. Thank you. How did you get interested in bumblebees in the first place?
So I've always been interested in insects in general. I've loved ever since I was little, looking in hedges, looking under stones, looking under logs, anything I could look under to find really tiny, cool-looking invertebrates. I got into bumblebees when I did my undergraduate degree, and I was taught by Juliet Osborne, who was then my PhD supervisor. And I really just thought I wanted to research something that has a purpose, and what greater purpose than a species that provides us with so much of our pollination. So it's a really key ecosystem service. And also they're really fluffy and really beautiful, and it's not hard to convince people why they should love bumblebees, which is really lovely. But it also kind of opens up the conversation to being able to talk about other things that sting, like wasps. And for some reason we see bumblebees as friendly and cute, which is true, and we see wasps as really evil and dangerous, and so I don't think that's true. I love wasps and I love bumblebees, and I think everyone should treat them both with respect, and then they'll hopefully leave you alone. I am just going to comment on the people who are getting honeybees. Anything you can do for bees is really great. I would just make sure you consider, so one of the downsides to honeybees is because there are so many of them, they can compete with wild bees for resources if there aren't enough resources in the landscape. So often where there's a honeybee hive, you'll find less wild bees in the vicinity because there's just so many honeybees going out and taking all the resources away. And I think it is something that has been used by a lot of different, I guess, people as something as like, you know, a silver bullet for bees is honeybees, but actually it's our wild bees that we need to always think about first. So the bumblebees and the solitary bees. So I would say, yeah, make sure that you've got enough flowers and everything in the landscape to support all of the types of bees before you definitely jump in and kind of get a honeybee hive.
Fantastic. Well, thank you very much today, Beth, and thank you everyone for coming along and for all your questions, your comments, all your contributions. Loveday's been putting some really important links in there, so thank you for those. Quick message here from Jenny Coombs. Good to hear from you, Jenny. Hi all, I'm doing my PhD on the diet of grape tits and can confirm that my dietary analysis came up with bees in the diet of my birds.
That's really cool.
Yeah, so all sorts going on there. We need to let you go, Beth, so thank you very much for coming along today. If the committee could stick around at the end of the call just for a little wrap up, everyone else you are free to go. Well, at this point we usually try and unmute everyone and do a round of applause, and then you're free to leave. So let's give this a try. David, if you're happy to try and unmute everyone and go with that.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you so much for all your amazing questions.
Thank you. Very good. Thank you.